So the trickier and tougher the opponents, the more likely I am to just fold to a 3-bet.
So I think we're in a pretty good spot to call and see a flop.
My typical action is going to be to fold this ace-queen.
Standard play here would probably be to fold.
Typical course of action here, I think, is very player dependent.
You could make a case, to fold or call.
A fold, probably about 2/3 of the time, and a 3-bet maybe about 1/3 of the time.
Just fold and sidestep this tough situation.
My typical response here would be to probably just call the re-raise.
I'd probably fold here, but if the raise is smaller, I'd be tempted to call it.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome once again to the Rec Poker Podcast, officially sponsored by Running Aces Casino and Racetrack. Now, today, in addition to our recreational contributors, which we have several, myself, along with Taylor Maas, Doug Behrens, Stacey Nelson, Derek Smith, Steve Olson, and Rob Washam, we also have input from 3 of our professional partners, Chris Fox Wallace, who is an author and also the leader of Next Level Poker, which is our official poker tour. Jonathan Little, author, great player, also leads PokerCoaching.com. And Mike Schneider, who is a Minnesota Poker Hall of Famer and leads the Poker is Fun tour. All right, as always, quick announcements. Please subscribe to the podcast, rate it, leave a comment, tell other folks about it, get as many people listening as we can. Super fun as we continue to grow our numbers. Also, we welcome all feedback, topic suggestions, hand situations. Reach out to me on Facebook, Twitter, or email me, stevefredlund@gmail.com. All right, today's our 3rd and final episode in this series where we look at specific situations, really trying to give insight into how different players view these decisions, but then also start asking questions about what would change to make you change your actions. And the idea really is to start to understand the key factors in the decisions, kind of the underwriting principles of the decision. So we start looking at factors that start competing and say which ones outweigh others, and I think that gives us good insight into this. So even if you disagree with somebody's course of action, think about how they're thinking about the hand. I think that's super important to understand your opponents, but also to understand, are there different ways to view that decision? And so that's what I love about this, is we're getting different answers even among the professional players, and I think it's helpful to understand the undergirding principles that each one of those folks are carrying with them. So take your time through this, listen to it carefully, wrestle with it a bit, and then love to hear what you're learning from this. So with that setup, let's just take a quick break here. We want to thank Running Aces, who's been a great sponsor of ours, and then we'll be back with the situation. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack has the best poker room in Minnesota, featuring 24/7 promos on all cash poker games, including earning $2 per hour in comps, plus the most player-friendly tourney structures. Visit runaces.com for daily promotions and the tournament calendar. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, the official sponsor of Rec Poker. Here's the situation for this week. Similar assumptions to the last couple of weeks, but a different hand scenario. We're assuming it's a 10-person table. We're in the early stages of the tournament. The blinds are 300, 600 with a 100 ante. Everyone has 30,000 in chips, or about 50 big blinds. Every player is a standard tight aggressive player. Now in this case, we are under the gun. So we are first to act right after the big blind, and we have ace-queen suited. We decide to raise to 1,500, which is about 2.5 times the big blind. Now the player 2 to our left, the under the gun +2 player, calls our 1,500. It folds around to the button, who then raises to 5,300. Both blinds fold, and it's back on us. So the questions I posed are, what is your typical course of action under the base assumptions? And then a number of questions about, if everything else is held equal, how would the changes in stack sizes or the player types or other things potentially change our action? This is actually one of the trickiest for me, because when the action is first on me, I could definitely see raising or folding. And in some of the tournaments that I play at Running Aces, I could even see limping, although I normally hate to do that. If it limps around, for example, say we limp and it limps around and we see it's 7-handed, I basically am just playing it for the nut straight draws and the nut flush draws, and I'm sort of surrendering the equity in the rank of the cards unless it absolutely crushes the flop. Now, in the event that someone raises over the limpers, then I can easily call and see a flop for the same price as if I had raised and someone called, or I could potentially even 4-bet them or 3-bet them as a way of stealing the steal. However, I'd still rarely open limps, so I'm left with basically folding or raising. I've come to really appreciate the findings that are in Chris Fox Wallace's book called No Limits that he wrote with Adam Stempel. Now, their research found that in cash games, the only profitable under-the-gun opens are pocket 7s or better. I think it was 7s. It could have been 8s, but 7s or 8s or better, and then ace-king, suited or unsuited, and ace-queen suited. So this ace-queen suited hand is at the bottom of the opening range, meaning it's only modestly profitable. This doesn't mean the hand isn't good. I mean, ace-queen suited is a good hand, but its value is severely diminished when you combine hand strength with other factors, such as the probability of someone else waking up with a bigger hand, because we still have 9 players left to act, and also position, where it's much easier to lose big and win small. When I have ace-queen and I win a pot out of position, either stealing blinds or through the course of the action, it tends to be a small pot. But when ace-queen suited loses a pot out of position, it tends to be a large pot. So this is purely hypothetical, but assume when ace-queen suited out of position wins a pot, it's a net profit of about 5 big blinds, and when ace-queen suited loses a pot out of position, it's a net loss of about 20 big blinds. Again, this is just hypothetical, but if that was the case, it means that you would need to win 4 times as much when you're out of position as when you lose, just to break even. So hopefully you see the point, even though it's a hypothetical example. If you're in a situation where you're either going to win small or lose big, you've got the probability that you win have to be severely in your favor, just to even break even or to make a modest profit. Now, generally, I'm going to do what I did here in the example, and that is to raise, but I will be wary. So let's get to the actual question. When the under-the-gun 2 calls and the button raises, I'm put to a decision. I'm generally going to call a button 3-bet here because I think it's just too much equity in the hand. This is a situation where I tend to think people play like me. I consider myself a tag, but who knows? I would be extremely tempted to 3-bet here on the button with a range that might include pocket 8s or better, ace-king, ace-queen, and maybe even mixing in some strong suited connectors like king-queen, queen-jack, jack-10. Part of this is because although I respect the under-the-gun raise, I think good strong players have more in their range than just the top few hands. So if they are balancing their under-the-gun range with some more speculative hands, my 3-bet from the button should work here a decent amount. Also, it's a good squeeze spot with likely some dead money in there with the under-the-gun +2 just calling. So unless they are trapping from that spot, they will likely fold to my 3-bet on the button. So if I'm the under-the-gun player and I'm trying to think like the button, I now think the button has a range of pocket 8s or better, ace-king, ace-queen, and some strong suited connectors. So I like my ace-queen suited better against this than someone who is really just a nitty-tight player. So I would consider 4-betting here on occasion, but usually I would just call against this raise and then see what the under-the-gun +2 player does and what the flop brings. I'm probably going to continue. I'll probably check call on a flop that contains an ace, a queen, or something like jack-10-7, where I have 2 overs and a draw to the nuts. On a flop that gives me the nut flush draw, I'm very likely to check raise or maybe even check shove. If I don't connect with ace-queen or some sort of a good draw, I will likely just fold to aggression on the flop. If I continue on the flop with a check call, I'll see what happens on the turn. If my opponent continues on the turn and I don't improve, then I likely fold. If the turn goes check-check, it's likely that I'll take a shot on the river depending on what comes. If I end up with showdown value like an ace or a queen in the river, then I would just likely check call on the river. But if it's sort of a blank and I think my opponent's weak, I may take a shot on the river to steal the pot. So thinking ahead like this helps me not to overplay my ace-queen. In many people's minds, just calling the preflop 3-bet actually underrepresents my hand. While great players will see ace-queen as likely the bottom of my range, a lot of recreational players won't be able to believe that I didn't go all in pre-flop with ace-queen suited, and they're certainly never going to believe I didn't bet when I hit an ace or a queen on the flop. So in summary, I would generally call the 3-bet pre-flop and then assess from there. Now, considering how stack sizes would impact my decisions, I'm probably not really impacted by the button stack size unless they are re-raising me with a short stack. If they shove with 15 big blinds or less, I probably would call, assuming that I'm still at 50 big blinds. If they raise but do not shove, and it represents over a third of their stack, I'm going to give good players credit for having a really big hand here, because why wouldn't they shove? It would be easier for me to actually find a fold here in that situation. Also, if the under the gun +2 player called my pre-flop raise and they were short stacked, say like they had 10 big blinds or less, I would wonder why they didn't shove. There's a material chance there that they are trapping. So instead of just fearing the button 3-bet, I do have more fear in the under the gun +2 player. And that would probably increase the chance I would fold to a button 3-bet. Now in terms of player types, if the button was a very liberal 3-better, playing a lot of hands, applying a lot of pressure, loving the squeeze play, I would assume their range to be quite a bit wider, and although they could have a monster hand here, of course, there's a greater likelihood that I could 4-bet, raise, or shove, and either get them to fold or get it all in with what could very well be the best hand or racing against a middle pair. And if it's not the best hand, I think I have a fair amount of equity against everything but ace-ace. Remember that ace-ace only has 3 combinations now because I have an ace blocker. So there's only 3 combinations of pocket aces left because I blocked 3 of the other combinations. So if they do have a big pair, kings, something like that, I still have an over and I still have a fair amount of equity. Now, if the button player is extremely tight and hasn't 3-bet all day, it would almost be a snap fold for me in this spot. Now, considering the under the gun +2 player, nothing would change for me unless I know them to be an extremely tough and deceptive player. If I call the button raise, do I think there's a reasonable chance that they will try to 4-bet re-steal the button with either a monster or just smelling an opportunity now that I've shown a bit of weakness by not 4-betting? I would then be put in a tough spot with my ace-queen suited, knowing that I could very well have the best hand because of this being an opportunistic play by them, but all of a sudden I'm putting my entire stack in the middle, more than 80 big blinds, with ace-queen. Not ideal. So the trickier and tougher the opponents, the more likely I am to just fold to a 3-bet. If the players are weaker and more straightforward, I'm more prone to just call, trusting they will help me range their hands and giving me more opportunities to outplay them or get them to make mistakes. So those are my thoughts. Let's hear from our other recreational players, Rob, Doug, Stacey, Taylor, Steve O, and Derek.
Okay, this is Rob Washam responding to the Rec Poker January 27th hand situation. Everybody knows already it's 10-person table, 30,000 each, blah, 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 blah. Here we are, we're under the gun with ace-queen suited, and we raise to 1,500. The under the gun +2 player calls. Then the button wakes up and raises to 5,300. Both blinds fold, and now what do we do? Very interesting spot, I think. A difficult spot. The button is in a typical steal spot, which means he could have a range much wider than normal. I believe my hand is too good to fold, so I wouldn't want a 4-bet to reopen the betting. Under the gun +2 is not likely to 4-bet, so I think we're in a pretty good spot to call and see a flop. I would check all flops to see what the button does from that point on. Now, holding all else equal, how would the stack size of the under the gun +2 caller have to change for us to change our action? Well, if the under the gun +2 had a shovable stack, I would be more inclined to fold and wait for a better spot. I would hate to call the 3-bet only to have to fold to a 4-bet. It's not going to be very profitable to go 3 ways to a flop out of position in a 4-bet pot. All right, holding all else equal, how would the stack size of the button re-raiser have to change for us to change our action? If the button is short, I wouldn't expect him to make this play without a monster or at least a hand he would call a jam with. In this case, I would again have to fold and wait for a better spot. Being out of position limits our ability to play this hand profitably. So, holding all else equal, how would our stack size have to change for us to change our action? I guess if my stack size is larger, I wouldn't do a thing different. If I had less than 20 big blinds, this would be a good spot to 4-bet jam. we'd have a ton of fold equity over the under the gun +2 player, and the button would have to have a monster to call. And what we said earlier is that his range could be much wider than that based on the fact that he was in a steal spot to begin with. So I think that'd be a good spot with about a 20 big blind stack to just go ahead and jam, get it in, use our fold equity, and go from there. All right, holding all else equal, how would the player type of the under the gun +2 caller have to change for us to change our action? I think the under the gun +2 player type is not a concern based on how the hand has progressed so far. I guess a maniac or a leg or even a nit with a monster would have 3-bet to begin with. Any one of these player types are more than likely going to fold to a 3-bet or at worst call. So I would expect the under the gun +2 player to play it pretty close to the vest at this time based on the fact that he just called my original raise. So holding all else equal, how would the player type of the button re-raiser have to change for us to change our action? The only player type that would give me pause would be the nit. A nit does not usually make a 3-bet without a very strong hand. We could probably comfortably fold our hand to a 3-bet by a nit, rather than try to outflop and try to play the hand out of position. The only other player type the button might change my response would be if I know the button is really, really loose and aggressive, almost guaranteeing that his range includes all kinds of hands that we would be way ahead of. That might give me, that might, I'm going to say based on how I've played against him so far and what I've seen him do, it might prompt me to actually 4-bet here if we had some sort of loose, aggressive maniac in the button position. I could very well 4-bet to try to isolate him with a better than usual hand or a better than normal hand, much better hand than what his range would be at that time. But that would be the only other player that's the only player types that I would change my my action with in this hand. So all in all, I think it's a pretty interesting spot. Again, my hand is too good. I'd hate to have to fold it. So I'm going to play to try to see the flop without getting too crazy on this. And that's my take. Thanks for listening.
This is Doug Behrens, responding to the January 27th hand, which just seems to be out there to mess with our heads, because Fox has clearly told us that ace-queen under the gun isn't profitable for the last year. But I'm a rec player. I think ace-queen is profitable. Clearly, it's almost as good as pocket aces or anything else. And so I'm normally willing to put some chips in. So I would have raised under the gun just like this. That would be my typical action. Now, we got a caller, and we got a re-raise from the button. My typical action is going to be to fold this ace-queen. With great duress, unless those guys are real loose aggressive, and the table's been betting big as sort of a history on light hands, which isn't normally true on the tables I play on. So then as we go into this, how would stack sizes of the call or the button change my behavior here? I'm always sensitive to stack sizes behind me or in front of me, and everybody at the table. And if anybody's small and they're going to jam and their action behind me on my entry bet here, I'm going to just fold. I don't want all my chips out there with an ace-queen early in the tournament. If the button has a real big stack and has, just been getting lucky a lot or something like that, and he's not necessarily a loose, aggressive player or something, it makes me want to come in thinking the ace-queen is ahead of something. But probably not. I'm probably folding here almost all the time. So all else being equal, what would have to change to get me in there is sort of the way this comes. And if the button's a loose, aggressive, maniac type player, I'm probably calling. It's a stubborn vein comes in there, and I get tired of folding all of my hands, and I tend to put chips in bad sometimes because of that. The undergun +2 is the danger here. So, if I call, he's getting priced in pretty good to come in, and we're going to assume he has a pretty good hand. He wouldn't have thought I had nothing. So, I think I'm 60-40 on folding almost all conditions here, and I will wait to listen to what everybody else has to say.
Giving some background information on myself might be helpful. I'm a fairly new player, 5 to 7 years into playing poker, so I don't have a ton of experience. Not that I'm brand new, but I feel I know where some of my strengths are and some of my weaknesses, and I'm not the most experienced player out there, so I'm not necessarily always out to outplay people post-flop, as I've heard other players are, like Fox, and I've heard other people as well. They love getting into pots even without the best hand to outplay them. That's not my strength. I believe my strength more lies with being patient and waiting for good situations where I can either be in charge of the hand or definitely be in position. So with that said, having ace-queen under the gun and then being re-raised doesn't play into my strengths. And so my standard play here would probably be to fold. Not that I want that always to be that way, but with my skill level right now, that would probably be my smartest move. And looking at some of the factors that might change that, I guess I would look at the players that are at the table, and if they're all standard aggressive, tight aggressive, I would put myself in that range. And so I'm thinking, kind of, what would I be playing in this range if I'm doing the re-raising? And I'm going to give him credit for ace jack, maybe down to ace 10 on up, and nines on up. Now, some of you might vary, and I'd like to kind of hear what people are thinking on his hand range and being willing to do that. And that's because he's on the button. But I'm thinking I can give him credit for those, but the chances are he's probably playing the higher end of those, would be my guess, at least at the tables that I've been playing at. I don't see people making this move much, especially early in a tournament there with much less than an ace-queen. And so maybe an ace-jack, but I'm thinking I'm either tied or behind a good share of the hands that this person would be making this move with, which turns it around, and it's maybe another podcast of looking and saying, how do we look for spots like this where he puts pressure on me? Because I'm looking with ace queen, I probably need to fold. I'm curious to see what other people would say. But would other people fold less than that? If I have definitely anything less than ace queen, it's a much easier fold. All right, back to the hand itself. I'm looking at the actions or the situations that would change my action, and I really don't think stack sizes of anybody would change my action until it gets down to, for me, where I feel I need to go all in. And even that, they're putting in 5,300 is what, almost around nine bigs. So, boy, to go over the top of that, I'd be putting in 20 bigs, and that's a third of my stack. I'm almost ready to go all in there, and I guess I don't want to do that. It's too not the situation I want to look for. So stack sizes, I don't see that it would change my action. Again, I'm hoping to get some insight from you guys on that. What might change my action, though, is the player himself, the re-raiser. Not necessarily the undergun +2 guy, but the actions of the player that raised me. If he was a loose aggressive player, might be more willing to come over the top or even shove and be aggressive back here. But otherwise, I'm probably going to stick to my same action. A couple thoughts I have on this are sayings that come to my head are you can't win a tournament early in the early rounds, but you can lose one. And this looks like a situation for me where I could be setting myself up to lose. And another situation, like I said earlier, I was playing into my strengths. It just doesn't play into my strengths. So I would probably fold this here. Looking to this podcast to build enough strength into where I could play a hand like this. And I'd like to hear what other people have to say about how you'd play this post-flop if you were going to either call or re-raise. What you're looking for, what you would do. I'm really curious as to how people would play this out. Anyway, thanks for all the yous who put time into these podcasts and breaking down hands. I really find them very, very helpful for my game. And that's it. So I'll sign off here and listen to what you guys have to say. We'll see you at the felt.
Greetings, Rec Poker listeners. This is Taylor Maas. This is part 3 of our discussions of pre-flop decisions where the action is very theoretical. So in this situation, we are at a 10-person table. Blinds are 300, 600. Everyone has 50 big blinds, and all players at our table are standard, tight, aggressive players. So we are under the gun and decide to raise ace-queen suited to 2.5 big blinds or 1,500 in chips, which is a very standard raise. And the under the gun +2 player calls, and the button raises it to 5,300 or 3-bets it. Both blinds fold and it's back on us. So this is a very fun question to be discussing. So we had the under the gun action and raised, which should show strength. We have the under the gun +2 player calling, and the button decides to 3-bet us. The button makes it a very standard 3-betting size, which kind of puts us in a weird spot of, do we want to commit a sixth of our stack, calling it off pre, and do we want to raise, or do we want to fold, not knowing what this under the gun +2 player is going to do? So in a typical course of action here, I think is very player dependent. So a lot of my decisions here are going to come based off of how the table has been playing prior to this. Now, we don't know any of that information, so I'm going to make some inferences and say that the button has made a 3-bet before this, and it's not the first time making a 3-bet. And given that, I'm going to call with ace-queen suited, knowing that the under-the-gun +2 player is also likely going to call. Because as soon as we put in the extra chips, it makes it that much more likely that the under-the-gun +2 player is also going to. So we're very likely headed to a 3-way flop here, holding ace-queen suited, which I think has a lot of equity post-flop. So the things that would change this would be stack sizes. So if the button raiser has a bigger stack size, I'm more likely to call. If they have a lower stack size, it makes it more likely that they're trying to get money in with a very premium hand, and I might consider folding. What I mean by that is if they have, say, half of what everyone else does, or 15,000, and they're putting in a third of their stack, it seems kind of fishy to me that they should probably be putting in all their stack and not putting in a third, because they're probably not going to be folding after the flop. So that would be one of the red flags. And like I said before, with the 3-betting, if we've seen multiple orbits and this player has never 3-bet, that also is a red flag to me that they finally have a premium hand. And even though we have ace and queen blockers, we could very likely be up against, queens plus from this button raise, and we are going to be having a very tough time catching up on the flop. The other thing would be player type, and it goes back to the 3-betting likelihood. If they're all standard, tight, aggressive players, they're going to be 3-betting some portion of their range here, which makes me want to call. But if they are very tight players and they're not 3-betting much, like I just mentioned, it's going to be something where I'm looking to actually fold here instead of call. Ace-queen suited isn't that great of a hand, although it is a very nice looking hand. So this is probably the toughest decision that we've had in our 3-week series when we raise under the gun and get 3-bet. But I think the typical course of action here should be to call the initial raise and go to a 3-way flop, but not get too attached to our hand. But folding or even raising isn't out of the question. So until next week, this is Taylor Maas.
Hey gang, it's Steve-O here. Today we are talking about a hand scenario where we've raised with ace-queen suited. Under the gun, we have one caller, 2 positions to our left, and then the button re-raises. So for this scenario, we are going to assume that everybody has about 50 big blinds to start. The blinds are 300, 600 with 100 ante. We've raised under the gun to 1,500. We get a caller under the gun plus 2, and once again the button raises to 5,300. So now it's our action. Tight aggressive. I think you could, with the tight aggressive raiser on the button, you could make a case, to fold or call. I certainly would never, put in a 4th bet with a hand like that. It's just too easily dominated. If you're really tight and you want to fold that hand, I think you could make a case. Most tight aggressive players are not going to put in a 3rd bet unless they're holding jacks, queens, kings, aces, ace, king. Maybe they have the same hand, but I doubt that there would be any weaker than that. We've got enough big blinds. We probably could take a flop. It's for about 1/6 of our chips. The problem with it is you're going to be playing a big pot. You're going to be playing it out of position to 2 players. And so I would proceed carefully at that point. And I always like to think too, what is my goal going into a hand? With my holding and where I'm playing it. I don't know that my goal is really to flop an ace in this situation or a queen. You could really have yourself in big trouble and end up dumping a lot of your chips. Obviously, we want to make a flush. We want to flop 2 queens. We want to flop an ace and a queen. That said, anyway, so we're going to assume in this situation, we're going to call, we're going to see the flop, make a decision from there. Like I say, I would definitely play it carefully and try and stay out of real trouble. In scenario 2, the stack size of the under the gun plus 2 player changes. If his stack size is short, meaning he's got 10 to 15 big blinds, he or she calls you, there's a raise. Let's say you call. There's a good chance with that many chips in that pot and that player being somewhat short, he might go ahead and rip it. He or she might go ahead and rip it and move all in. If he thinks, his middle pair is in a flip against an ace king on the button, you might try and squeeze it. If that was a situation, I would probably fold pre-flop then, because I sure don't want to, get into a 3-way all in, for not as half my stack to that player, but my whole stack to the button player. I don't think it makes sense, fairly early in the tournament like that. If he's got a big stack, I would probably try and just call and take a flop. Once again, see if I can make a big hand and win a lot of chips. It's the same situation as before. How heavily involved do you want to get with a hand like ace queen? Next scenario, how would the buttons chip stack change? Your thoughts. If he had a small stack and I thought that he or she might be a little bit weak, I might re-raise all in right then and there to get heads up with that player, trying, if I thought there was a good chance the player who called me would fold. And I just have to be, what's my feel for the situation? If that player has got a whole lot of chips and once again, maybe he or she is making that play with the suited ace jack or something, I would take the flop and go from there. Especially if that player is real aggressive. What would change depending upon the profile of the undergun +2 player? If I felt that player was a maniac, I would probably fold pre-flop, not wanting to get into some giant pot pre-flop with ace queen. And this is it doesn't happen very often, but if they are a pretty smart, sneaky player, and if there was a chance, they're calling you, let's say with aces or kings, praying to get re-raised, so then they could really show their strength. That's a bad situation there too. If he's just if he or she is a calling station, I'm certainly going to want to take a flop and see if I can get paid. I like I said, I can't imagine 4-betting with ace queen. I'd rather see the flop. If he or she in that position is just a great player, an eagle, don't get involved out of position with ace queen. It's just, in the long run, I can't, it's a loser. What would something change to force my decision making on the personality of the button? Kind of the same thing. If the under the gun +2 player is a bit of a mouse, the button's a weak player, I might just take a flop and just try and outplay him. It's just one of those things. It's so situational. Once again, taking a flop, playing conservatively, see what kind of a hand I could make. And like I say, typically players 3-betting in that spot are doing it with big hands, so there's a real good chance you're dominated from the get-go. As far as the last scenario, this is what factors could change my action. I think I'm going to answer just in general what I try to think about in any hand I'm going to play. What am I thinking about? It's really important to consider what is your current, image at the table. Have you been playing super tight? Have you been showing good hands? Have you been real active? So there's a good chance you're going to get a lot of action. That's certainly one thing I like to think about. How many hands have I been playing? If it's a real situation where not every player has the same amount of chips, how am I stacked against my opponents? What's my position? Obviously, I'm always going to want to play from position if I can. The other thing I think a lot of players, especially recreational players, don't think about is I always like to think a card ahead. Meaning, if I'm going to put in a raise or I'm going to call, how am I going to react if I'm called, if I'm raised? What sort of card is going to come on the next card? What am I going to do? It's always good to try and think a card ahead, because sometimes you'll end up realizing if you do that there's just not a good reason to be doing what you're doing. And I think many players are just simply playing the cards in front of them and not thinking ahead, not thinking about that kind of stuff. If I'm called, I always like to think about how does my opponent play. Once again, are they a mouse that you can push around? Are they a calling station that's never going to fold their hands no matter what you do? Are they a maniac that's going to raise you no matter what? But you can rarely ever believe they have it. Are you playing against just a great pro that knows exactly what they're doing? You got to think about all that stuff. And then you got to think about, the most likely scenario is you're going to miss the flop. You're out of position against, two other players. What are you going to do? And that kind of gets back to, playing a card ahead. That's about all I have for this hand. In general, go conservative with it. Don't, lose your whole stack playing ace queen out of position like that. If you can make a flush, great. Trip queen's great. Slim chance you can outplay people, go for it. But you really need to know your opponents for that. Thanks a lot, guys. Have a great day.
Hey, Rec Poker Podcast listeners. This is Derek Smith, everyday_81 on Twitter. Commenting on the ace-queen suited hand. Under the gun, we open to one call and a 3-bet by the button. The first question is, what's our typical course of action? And I'm actually going to skip ahead to the 2nd through 7th questions first because I have quite a lot to cover on the first one, so we'll bang out the follow-up questions first. And in fact, there's so much going on with that first question that I was working through and trying to kind of come to a decision on that I wanted to pull in a friend, and I did. His name's Dave Shun, chubby_darter on Twitter. And he's a close friend and another very good rec poker player who thinks very similarly to the same way I do about hands. And we got together and did quite a bit of math and quite a lot of discussion on this one. So if we want to just quick bang out 2 through 7, holding all else equal, how would the stack size of under the gun +2 have to change for us to change our action? Well, if he was significantly shorter, I'd be pretty wary of him having a very big hand. I mean, they certainly could be trying to see a flop cheap with a small pair, a non-nut type connecting hand, but I actually just feel like they'd probably be wanting to get that type of hand in right at that point. So it just makes me wary that they're looking for somebody else to 3-bet so they can get in the rest. So it does make me kind of wary of that. I just don't see why you'd flat with the intention of getting it in with that type of hand. So if they were significantly larger, I'd expect them to be more prone to raise from this position. And so I just expect they're trying to see a cheap flop. Holding all else equal, how would the stack size of the button have to change for us to change your action? Well, if he has a huge stack, I'd be more prone to 3-bet with my hand. If he's down to 10 to 15 bigs, I'd actually probably just fold because it sure seems to me like the money's going to be going in on the flop. And as I will explain later, I don't see a ton of scenarios where we're going to be ahead. How would our stack size have to change? If we were shorter, 10 to 15 bigs, I'd just ship it all in right there. If somehow everybody folds, great, we more than double up, but the button really has to call, and I guess I'm just glad to see how it goes from there. If we had a really large stack compared to the button or the table, I'd lean more towards the 3-bet. How would the player type of under the gun +2 have to change? I'll discuss that more in evaluating our base play. Same thing for what the player type of the button would have to be like for us to change our action. Again, same as the previous one. And then the last one was what other factors would drive us to potentially change our action. And I answered again the same as previous episodes. If we're on a bubble, what type of game are we playing in? A cheap daily, MSPT, ICM considerations, all that type of stuff. So going back to the first question, which is what is your typical course of action under the base assumption? And here again, we have ace queen suited and we open. Under the gun +2 calls, and then the button 3-bets to 5,300. Well, I actually think this is a really tough decision at this point. My initial just instant gut reaction was I'd probably call and just see a flop. I've got a pretty decent hand. It's about a sixth of my stack to call. Although I'll be out of position, I probably have the type of hand that I'm going to hit big or not and get out of it. So my initial thought was just to call and see. But after a lot of work and discussion with Dave Shun and working through a lot of math, I actually now think that calling is the worst possible decision of the three scenarios, and I now lean towards a fold or a 3-bet. And after rolling through everything, I think I'm about 2/3 of the time folding and about 1/3 of the time 3-betting. And here's what's going on. There's 4 pieces of what I kind of have gone through to come up with that decision. The first is, what is under the gun plus 2 up to? The second thing is related to my expected odds. The third was related to my relative position on the flop. And then fourth, what do we actually want to flop here? So if we look at those things, I think it's confusing that under the gun plus 2 just flatted. Now, we are working off the base assumption that everyone's a tight aggressive player, and as mentioned earlier, the player type of under the gun plus 2 and or the button 3-better really drives our decision making, I think, here. If both ourselves and under the gun plus 2 know that the button is a very savvy player, a very opportunistic player, potentially a loose player, I'd be wary that under the gun plus 2 is actually playing a really big hand here with the intention of seeing if somebody in the cutoff, hijacker, button, and that type of player will 3-bet so that they can come back over the top. And it seems obvious at first that, well, they probably just have, something like 2s through 6s or that non-nut type connecting hand where you just kind of want to see a cheap flop, and very likely they may have that. But I think if under the gun plus 2 is a really tricky player and creative and has kind of thought this through and recognizes the player types yet to act behind, it's a great spot if you had something like, let's say you have kings, to just flat and let somebody else do your raising here, because then related to the second part of what I was just discussing, the expected odds, because what then ends up happening is, in this exact scenario, the button 3-bets 5,300, it comes back to me. If I'm running the pot odds here, it's maybe a call, it's maybe not a call. It all kind of depends how you feel about playing the hand. But the odds that are specifically there right now aren't what I expect them to be, because if I call, I very much expect under gun plus 2 to at least call. So I'm banking on that there's going to be an additional 3,800 in if I call the 3,800 at least. And under the gun plus 2 very well, if they are a tricky smart player, knows this too. And they know that I'll be thinking that. So what a great spot with something like kings. And now there's in roughly the area of about, I think 19, maybe 19, 20 grand, something like that, sitting in the pot. And if they're sitting on kings, they can just ship it for the remaining 25. And depending on what big blind's got, I know I'm folding ace queen at that point if they do that. They've set up a great it would be a really good play. They've set up a nice situation for themselves. So to me, I'd be really wary of what under the gun plus 2 is up to, and be really conscious of what type of player they are. If they are not very creative, not very savvy, potentially newer to the game, not paying super close attention to positional advantages and things like that, then I would again lean towards they've probably just got a hand they want to see a cheap flop with. And if that's the case, I'm more apt to want to 3-bet. And in that scenario, that's going to be the 1 out of the 3 times where I'm in a 3-bet. And that's going to be a part of it. Same thing with the big blind. If they're, like I said, a very creative player or a very aggressive player, or someone who would just recognize, hey, this is a good squeeze spot, then I might 3-bet. I think that's another scenario where I think it's a 1 out of 3 times I'm going to want to 3-bet in that spot then and pump it back up when it comes over to me. Especially if both those players tend to be a bit more straightforward, I think, and or really loose if the button happens to be that way. So, but again, assuming that both these players are your typical tight, aggressive players, I think that we're just kind of in a world of hurt here, getting our money in here, even though we have really good expected odds. And that's because of both the third and the fourth scenario that I described, which is our relative position on the flop, and then what do we want to flop. So speaking about our relative position, what typically is going to happen is if we call the 5,300, 3,800 more, and under the gun plus 2 also just flats, typically on the flop, it's going to go check, check, bet by the button. And now we have to act, and we're in the worst position because the under gun plus 2 player gets to close the action. So they get to see what we do before they have to make any sort of decision. So we have the worst relative position, and we're just out of position. At this point in time, the button, we have nothing to define what their hand is. We have some thoughts about what under the gun +2 has, but we can't be certain. No definition of what the button is 3-betting with. And I don't know, that's it's not a scenario I like to be in for, I assume what's near to a pot bet, there's going to be about at least half of what we have left in our stack. So I don't like our relative position. And then I come back to what do we actually want to flop here? And this is where it gets tricky because, again, if we feel like under the gun +2 is just playing I want to see a flop type of hand, there's a ton of flops that hit that. If there's a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7 on the flop, they may have flopped a set. If there's any sort of connecting hands like 9, 8, 10, Jack, King, Queen, Queen, Jack, just any of those type of connecting hands, they could have flopped 2-pair, open-ended straight draw, or trips, I suppose, too, but other things. Big things. There's a lot of big draws out there. And same thing for the button. It's just because they raised from the button doesn't mean they can't have a hand. And so in a scenario where they potentially have something like jacks, queens, kings, we're in a world of hurt. So against kings, we're a 32 to 68 dog. If they have aces, we only have a 12% chance of winning. But even against queens, it's 34 to 65. They could have jacks, and they're still about 45, 55. That button could easily 3-bet with something like a pair of 8s or a pair of 9s, and they still have us at about a 47 to 53% deficit to catch up and win. So what are we trying to actually flop on this flop? If we flop a queen high flop, we can feel pretty good about it, but we can't feel great. We could certainly be up against kings. Aces seem a little less likely since we have an ace, but we certainly could be up against 2 players, a set, a bigger pair. Do you feel amazing about a queen high flop? I don't. If it's queen 8-7, I don't feel great about it. If we flop an ace, we could easily be up against ace king. And that's a tough scenario too, because now how are we not going to pay off? Of course, we'd like to flop a flush. We've got the nut flush, opportunity, but that's 118 to 1. We'd like to flop a straight, but that's 76 to 1 to happen. So the best case scenario that I can think of that we're looking to flop here is a 4 flush. And that's still just a drawing hand. Assuming that we believe there's a 36% chance we actually get to the flush, first you have to think of the math that's involved with getting a 4 flush in the first place. It only happens roughly about 12% of the time. So 1 in 8 times we'll flop that 4 flush, but 7 out of 8 times we won't. And now we'll have put in, near to 20% of our stack, and we're kind of in no man's land. And even if we do flop the 4 flush, I don't believe that we have a full 9 outs. This is a 10-handed table, so if you think we've got 3 players in, there's 6 cards out there. 7 people fold us, there's 14 cards dead. There's 3 cards by the time the hand's completely over that are going to be burned. So we're looking at roughly 18, 20, 21 plus cards that we're not going to see. So if every 4th card is our suit, we're potentially losing 4 or 5 of our outs on average. So we're really drawing with 2 streets to go to potentially 3, 4, 5 outs to the nut flush. And assuming that either under the gun and or the button actually do have a quality strong hand, the chips are going to be getting in there anyway. So for all these reasons, I lean more towards a fold, but I do see a lot of merits towards why we would 3-bet, again, based on the player type and what we think under the gun +2 is up to. And again, potentially how loose, aggressive, or creative the 3-better pre-flop is. So again, thanks to Dave Shun for his help in going through a lot of this math and chatting this out. Again, I was very surprised because I would have immediately kind of thought a call would make sense here. And now I see that I dislike a call quite a bit. And again, lean more towards a fold, probably about 2/3 of the time, and a 3-bet maybe about 1/3 of the time. This has been Derek Smith for Rec Poker. Thank you.
All right, thanks guys so much. Let's take a quick break here to thank our official sponsor, Running Aces, and then we'll come back with thoughts from our experts. And a reminder, this week we have input from Jonathan Little of PokerCoaching.com, Mike Schneider of the Poker is Fun Tour, and Chris Fox Wallace of Next Level Poker, our official tour for Rec Poker. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack has the best poker room in Minnesota, featuring 24/7 promos on all cash poker games, including earning $2 per hour in comps, plus the most player-friendly tourney structures. Visit runaces.com for daily promotions and the tournament calendar. Running Aces Casino and Racetrack, the official sponsor of Rec Poker.
Dude, people are like, "Are you little? Because your name says you're little." I say, "No, I'm not little."
Hello, this is Jonathan Little for PokerCoaching.com. Today we have one more situation similar to the previous 2 weeks. Make sure you go back and listen to those if you have not already. This time we're playing at a 10-handed table early in a tournament, 300, 600 blinds with 100 ante with a 50 big blind stack, 30,000 chips. Every player, again, is standard, tight, aggressive. We are under the gun with ace-queen suited and raised to 2.5 big blinds. Under the gun +2 calls, so we get called by under the gun +2. And then folds around to the button who 3-bets to 5,300. All right, what's our typical course of action in this spot? Well, the first thing you want to figure out is how wide is the button 3-betting. If the button knows that your under the gun range should be pretty strong, like, I don't know, pocket 7s are better and maybe ace-10 suited and better and maybe king-queen suited, maybe king-jack suited, maybe queen-jack suited, maybe jack-10 suited, and then it's like ace-king and ace-queen. I mean, if that's your early position range, then this guy has to be really tight. So ace-queen suited is going to be somewhat near the middle of that range, and I don't actually just hate folding if you are actually playing tight under the gun 10-handed like you should. If your opponent thinks that, he's supposed to 3-bet stuff like ace-jack suited or, pocket 8s in the spot, then you should definitely stick around, probably by calling. You don't really want to be 4-betting this hand, because if you 4-bet and get jammed on, well, that's a pretty rough spot. And also if you 4-bet to, let's say, 10,000 to min 4-bet, even if your opponent shoves, now you're getting 2-to-1 pot odds, and you're really close to that. You could also just go all in over the 5,300 for your 30,000 stack, but that is risking a bit much. And whenever you do get called by presumably your opponent's somewhat strong range, you're going to be in bad shape. So either call or fold. I think either play is reasonable. If you tell me I'm opening under the gun 10-handed and the button 3-bets me and the button's a standard, tight, aggressive player, I'm just folding every time. All right. How would changing basically any of the players' stack size change our play? And this is a situation where if we're shorter and our opponent 3-bets in this spot, like let's say he does make it 5,300 and we only have 15,000. I mean, he has to have a really big hand. So the main factor here that is dictating my play is the fact that I know that my under the gun range 10-handed should be really nitty. And if that's the case, and someone who is also a standard, tight, aggressive player is 3-betting from the button, they just have to have a strong hand if they're competent. And I'm making the assumption that they're competent. So I think this is just going to be a fold a lot of the time. As you get shorter, maybe you should be more inclined to shove. Like say we do have that 15,000 stack and we do decide to stick around, maybe we should be shoving as opposed to calling with that stack. The player in the middle, I don't think is that big of a deal. Usually, well, it actually depends on the opponent's strategy, right? If you've read my books, I do not advocate 3-betting under the gun raisers at all. So if your opponent under the gun +2 who called is calling with hands like aces and kings, well, now you have to proceed with way more caution as opposed to someone who 3-bets their aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace-king, right? Because if they're 3-betting their best hands, it means their calling range is going to be stuff that ace-queen does well against. So we're not so concerned about that player in that spot. But if the opponent has the nut hands in his range, then you should be even more inclined to fold. So, okay, how does changing the opponent's player types dictate our strategy? Well, we just discussed under the gun +2. If that player's calling with their nut hands, you need to be very cautious and much more inclined to fold. If the button it becomes a more aggressive player or just doesn't realize that your under the gun range should be very tight, you should certainly consider shoving in the case where also the caller is somewhat capped at having non-aces, kings, queens, jacks, ace, king. If the 3-better is very tight, you should definitely fold. So don't be too married to this hand. It's not particularly great. What other factors would change our course of action? I mean, as we get shorter, I guess we should be more inclined to go with this hand. Like, say we have 10,000 chips, but even then, I don't think folding's insane. I mean, you just have to be very aware of what your range looks like and how your opponent's playing. And My one gripe with these questions is that every player is a standard tight aggressive player, and that is very rarely the case. Also, the tournament is 10-handed. A lot of tournaments nowadays don't play 10-handed. I'm trying to think. I don't even remember the last time I played 10-handed, but I do realize a lot of like main events where tournament venues are tight on space, they do play 10-handed, sometimes 11-handed. And in those cases, you have to realize under the gun, you really should be playing really, really, really tight. If you play around with Game Theory Optimal poker solvers, they will say to fold hands like pocket 10s under the gun, 10-handed, when you're playing like 100 big blinds deep with no antes. Obviously, this is a little bit different because we're 50 big blinds deep with an ante, so you should be a little bit more active, but it's okay to play really snug. I don't know what the exact range the Game Theory Optimal programs would say in this spot, but I would bet it's something like pocket 9s are better, ace-king suited, ace-queen suited, maybe ace-jack suited, and ace-king. Something like that, like really, really tight, right? And if that's the case, ace-queen suited is very near the bottom of your range anyway, so it's perfectly fine to fold that. But most people don't play that way. They play way too loose because they see hands like Jack 10 suited and think they need to open it every single time, regardless of the scenario. So anyway, that's enough rambling about this one. Just fold and sidestep this tough situation unless the player on the button is very active, in which case you should probably go all in unless you think the caller is trappy or just very good.
He's won $1 million.
Hi, this is Mike Schneider of the Poker is Fun tour. And this is a pretty tricky question here, just being that all players involved are around 50 big blinds deep. I guess under the base assumptions here, like assuming we don't really have that great of reads on the cold caller or the re-raiser, my typical response here would be to probably just call the re-raise. I mean, if we made it 1,500, the button made it 5,300, it's 3,800 more. Yeah, that kind of sucks when we start the hand with 30,000, but I think ace-queen suited is too strong of a hand to fold. But on the converse, if we had ace-queen offsuit, I would strongly consider folding here. I mean, I think just with everybody at 50 big blinds deep, it's not quite the optimal stack sizes for us to consider re-raising, and I would consider folding a little bit more too if the original cold caller, like let's say they started the hand with like 10 or 15,000, because there's a solid chance if we end up calling, or even if they have like 20,000 even, like if we end up calling, they could end up just re-raising all in. Like if they have like pocket eights or something, they decide, screw this, maybe my re-raise is going to get us to fold. I could see a stack size of that variety just saying, all right, I'm just going to go with this. I hope somebody folds, and if not, oh well. But yeah, I would definitely, I mean, if let's say if us and the button who re-raised us happen to both have a few more chips in play, then it becomes either a much easier call, or you can, if you think that they are capable of having a little bit wider of a 3-betting range, you could definitely throw out a 4-bet here, which if you would, like if let's say we had 50,000, or even if they only had 30,000, we have like 50,000, you could try making it 12,000 or 14,000 or something, knowing that if they re-raise all in, you can fold, which, I mean, like the advantage of re-raising or making a 4-bet is that with having an ace and a queen, you're blocking pocket aces and pocket queens quite a bit, and granted, if they have ace king, you're blocking a couple of those too by having the ace, but yeah, it's just a really, really dicey spot with the stack sizes overall, and then this is another spot too where if we had like 15 or 20,000 chips instead, I would strongly consider just going all in here. Even though I will say amongst all of this, the caveat to what I'm talking about, the fact that we are an under-the-gun raiser, I think you have to give the buttons to re-raise a little bit more credit than had we opened in a mid position and they 3-bet us. Like in general, most people are aware that the typical player is opening fewer hands under the gun than a middle position, so that would make it more likely that this button is 3-betting us with a legit hand. but even still, some of those legit hands can be pocket nines, pocket tens, pocket jacks, etc., like that. And if they end up shoving on us, or calling the all-in, I should say, if we had less chips, then it's perfectly fine. We're more than likely to be flipping a coin against them. And then one last little point too, like if, say, the button had 15 or 18,000 or something like that, I would, again, much stronger consider re-raising here pre-flop, just simply on the basis of a little more happy to get it in against them while knowing that our re-raise pre-flop will get the original cold caller to fold, and you're just eating up a little extra dead money there. And yeah, I guess I can't really think of what else to say that might change what we would do on this, other than it's still just a really tricky spot, especially with ace-queen suited. It's a really well-worded question, and if it was ace-queen offsuit, it definitely changes a lot of the variables more towards folding, where like ace-queen suited is just barely a strong enough hand, although we still do have to be careful with it. And I'd say also then, if you don't know anything about the opponents and you like your table draw and think that you'll be able to get into some better spots against them, I wouldn't really hate folding this hand either. Like, it definitely is one where you just hate calling and flopping an ace and closing your eyes and having to check call a street or two, not really liking it, not hating it. But yeah, I guess so. With that, until next time, this is Mike Schneider of the Poker is Fun Tour. I would love it if you followed us on Twitter at PIFT Poker, or check out our website at piftpoker.com. And yeah, I'm happy to say that hopefully pretty soon now we should have an announcement about our next tournament stops. I've been in discussion with the casino or two about that, so things are coming together for us to have some events in 2018. And also, if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's at Schneids Poker, SCHNEIDSPOKER. Until next time, thanks and have a good day.
Fox here from Next Level Poker. Another fun 50 big blinds question this week. So, when we raise under the gun with ace queen, we're barely making a profit anyway. We know this from online poker statistics. Millions and millions of hands in databases. Lots of players have done the same thing that I did when I first started and got Poker Tracker, in compiling hands and looking at which hands are profitable. Ace-queen suited is profitable under the gun for most players in most situations, but not for everyone, not in every situation, and for even for strong players in a very tough situation, you could throw it away. It is way overrated, but it is in the list of hands that I recommend in my book. It's in fact, the bottom I say ace-king offsuit and ace-queen suited, meaning fold ace-queen offsuit in standard cash games. So ace-queen suited is playable, but when we raise it, we have to remember it's not super valuable. When under the gun +2 calls, he's likely to have some sort of medium strength hand, and everybody knows it. So when the button raises, he's not stealing from two of us, he's just stealing from us. The under the gun +2 player is not a big threat to the button. And the button has position. If the under the gun +2 calls, it's not a big problem because we know what his range is. His range is beheaded. He does, and it's all neck to knees. It's a middle strong hand range, and he never has a monster and he never has garbage. If he is in fact a standard tight aggressive player, so we know he has a hand like a pair of sixes or king queen suited or something. And the button raises, the button's not afraid of UTG +2, he's afraid of us. And in this case, he's saying he's really not afraid of us. Given that we're going to be out of position, the raise is a pretty reasonable size. If this was a raise to 4,000, I might have to call it. See if you flop two pair or a flush or flush draw or something. It's not such a bad thing to flop a flush draw when it's ace queen suited, because then you've got a flush draw and two big overcards. So I'd probably fold here, but if the raise is smaller, I'd be tempted to call it and see how it looks. I really don't want to play ace queen out of position against the button who's made a big raise and put a sixth of my stack in with ace queen and out of position. That's not a winner for me. The stack size of the under the gun +2 caller wouldn't change anything, unless he was below like 5 big blinds. It wouldn't change anything. And if he's below 5 big blinds, then I might call this so that he can get it in and we can see a flop and see how that goes. But it's not a super profitable spot when he's short stacked. The stack size of the button re-raiser would only make a big difference if he has, say, less than 10 big blinds. If he has less than 10 big blinds, I assume that he's a tag who's trying to be tricky with a pair of kings or a pair of aces, trying to get a full double up rather than shipping. It's a mistake, but that's almost always what it's going to be. If he has more than 10 big blinds, it doesn't matter that much to me. But if he has less than 10 big blinds, then I'd probably almost make an easier fold just because he's usually got a monster here. So for our stack size to change the action, I would have to have less than probably like 13, 14 big blinds, maybe 15. If I had 13 big blinds here, I might get it in and take that extra equity from UTG +2, putting the call in there and then the blinds, and just hope that I'm in a race against his range. If my stack is any lower than like 10 big blinds, I'm not raising under the gun. I'm shipping it all in. So there are not very many stack sizes where my stack would change the action. Player type for under the gun +2 is not going to change my action very often, but player type for the button might. If the button is a maniac, I may call him and see how the flop looks. But even then, you're putting yourself in kind of a bad spot. You're going to get it all in if you flop a pair. How often have you been busted by a maniac who actually had a hand when you flopped a pair? If he's weak tight, then I'm more likely to fold. His range dominates mine, my hand. The only way that I'm really excited about playing against him is if he's a very bad player who's very predictable and readable. Those are all and that's kind of a standard answer to every question. I love playing poker with people who are standard, readable, weak players who aren't educated about the game. And if he's that, then yeah, I love playing with him. If he's not, then I'm folding pretty much all the time.
Okay, so that's it for today. I think it was a great discussion, a longer episode, a lot of great input from a lot of really good players. So good luck trying to process all that and figure it out. And once again, make sure that you are looking for the concepts and the constructs behind the scenes, not just what should I do with ace-queen suited under the gun facing a 3-bet, but what are those principles that you want to ascribe and you want to incorporate into your game. So think about it from that perspective. As we look forward to the weeks ahead, we've got a couple of hand scenarios submitted by Doug Behrens from his experience in the Running Aces Avalanche tournament, and also an interesting hand from Taylor Maas. And we're also going to spend an episode in the future talking about just sort of terminology in poker. As I've listened to a lot of the input, as I've talked to people at the table, there's a lot of confusion on some of the actual terminology of poker. So we might just spend an episode talking about some of the terms and make sure that we're all using those consistently. But that's what's coming up. Again, subscribe to the podcast, rate it, leave a comment, tell your friends, give feedback, topic suggestions, hand situations to me on Facebook, Twitter, or email stevefredlund@gmail.com. Just a reminder, there is a Rec Poker Facebook group as well as a Twitter @RecPoker. So until next week, thank you all. Take care.